Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining today's Ascendo Reliability webinar. And one of the things that we often do as a reliability engineer is deal with data. And sometimes the data is pretty easy to deal with, and sometimes it's really hard to find. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about the combination of where do you find the data you need, dealing with field data and how well your product's performing in the field, but also, then what do you do with it? And what can you do with it? Those kinds of things. And so a couple different aspects of that. And doing a little housekeeping here on the side, but I think I'm in pretty good shape. So the basic idea is, I should back up a little bit. I'm getting ahead of myself and my own thoughts here, is that it's a big area. It's a big field. And we deal with data in all kinds of shapes and forms and sizes, from doing estimates and experiments and so on. Yet at the end of the day, our products go out to our customers, and they're the ultimate judge of how well it meets their expectations. And for some products, we have a warranty. Most products have some kind of warranty or service agreement associated with them, and we get feedback in one form or another. And that's what I mean by the field data. It's the essence of what the the feedback is, and people telling us that something our product is working or it's not working, and to what extent, those kinds of things. So let me move on to my first slide. So one of the things we collect data for is to answer questions, and it's basically using that feedback to get a sense, is the product performing as expected? So we may have set a goal for the product to see no more than 2% failing over a say a year or 2 years, something like that. And is it on track to do that? As the products age, as customers use them, are they meeting our expectations to be working? Another question we might ask is, well, what is failing and what can we do about it? It's always a dilemma as you sit in the final design review and say, are we ready to ship? Is it going to be reliable or not? And you may be asked to actually, provide that kind of information, is some assurance, so to speak, uh, that the product is ready to go. Well, as we collect field data, we can start getting the answer to that. We can start answering that question. Are we meeting our requirements? Another thing we can do is adjust our warranty accruals. Uh, Years ago, when I was working at Hewlett Packard, we took a look at the warranty figures for each of the approximately 50 product lines, 50 divisions. And the biggest reason that a particular product line missed their numbers for the quarter or missed their projections for profitability was that they either put aside too much warranty accruals, the money set aside to pay for warranty, because they overestimated how many failures they would have, and vice versa. Some had to pull money out of profits and put it into their warranty accruals to pay for warranty because they underestimated the problem. And so as we track field data, the feedback we're getting is we can fine tune or adjust our warranties, which impacts the business's profitability and expectations. And another reason is to look for problems. It's that this one almost always tends to show up on a Friday afternoon where a customer calls with a problem that is catastrophic or is an indicator of a batch problem that every product will see. And much like just recently, Samsung probably had that phone call uh, and realized that they were going to have to do a recall. And they had a number of incidents with their new flagship phone and announced a major recall. And that's usually not good for business. Hopefully they've managed it correctly, and got on the problem before it caused any major problems for people. Uh, by if you ignore the feedback you're getting from the field, you may miss something that you can get ahead of and mitigate or minimize the overall impact it would have. And so we look at field data for obviously for lots of different reasons. And the hard part though is where do you get it? Where do you get the field data? Most reliability engineers, especially if the organization doesn't have a robust process of dealing with the data and you're just getting it started, you may have some work to do just to find the information, just to find the data. Now, you may hear a little bit of background noise. I'm not sure if you can hear the construction going on. We are having a bathroom vanity replaced and moved in, so of course they show up today to take out the wall, so you might hear a little bit of background noise. So apologize for that. So where do we find data? And geez, we got people from Europe, Bangalore. I think Ravi, you're going to win from the furthest away. Uh, but I'm curious is where do you find data? And but let me start with just the first idea is, well, what data do we really need? And let me know if you're doing the task of saying gathering field data or looking for the data, what is it you need to do your analysis? And please use the chat window or the Q&A tab. Hey, Cecilia. Hopefully your trip to San Diego went well, if you're the same Cecilia. And so what data do you need? Ideally, we have complete records of how the product was used, where it was used, how often it was used, what was the environment around it, how many units are out there, what's the risk that they're facing, what are the expected failure mechanisms, what were the actual failure mechanisms, um, how long it was, when it was installed and put in commission and put into service, when did it fail, why did it fail, what were the symptoms, what was the root cause, uh, time to failure, yeah, the size of the population, all kinds of good stuff, right? Do you ever get all of that information? I'm sure there's some uh, businesses or organizations where you get great data. I have data on replacements only. Yeah, that happens, Ravi. All right, get all the data. Never. No, you're exactly right, Robert. Is I've run into organizations that they're the only repair center. Uh, and so they were the only ones that could open this box to do the repair. And they only made about 30 of these boxes. These were some unique little military box of some, I don't even know what it did. And so they thought they had perfect data. But it turned out that the end users would put the broken boxes on the side and not report it until it was convenient for them to do so. So that the time to failure data was off sometimes as much as 6 months. And so later they installed um, operating hour meters basically that just tracked how often it was used and refined that data quite importantly, or refined it quite a bit and took out a lot of the error when they were estimating when it went into service and when it came out of service when it failed. Yeah, and what we're finding, and I agree with you, Thomas, is that the number of failures that get reported, especially for lower cost products, is often an a, a lower threshold. The number of actual failures is probably higher because some customers will have already retired the product, or they have uh, it failed and they decided to buy a competitor's product and not bother to get it repaired or reported. Some customers just ignore the failure, maybe a feature or a function that they're not using and they have a workaround for it or they don't need it. Um, Others just give up on the product and don't report it. So depending on your product and your particular market and customers, you may have more or less accurate data, but rarely do we have everything. So what do we need as a minimum? You know, what's the basic minimum that we need? Let me check through the notes here. A couple of them went flying past here. Yeah, traceability is usually very helpful. Ship date and approximate time to the event or the failure. Let's see, that was is Jeff, lot number, population size, all kinds of good information. Time to repair or failure. And I agree, Ravi. That's about the minimum we need. And if we can get it down to the hours and minutes, that would be great. Many products I've worked with over the years is they understand how many units they ship every month, how many came off the manufacturing line and went off into their market. They have some rough estimate as to how long between shipping out and when it gets installed. It might be a couple of weeks or it might be a couple of months. And understanding how their customers purchase it, their products, and put them into use, they get some idea of an offset there. And then failures, it's really just when the customer calls. And if we can link that failed unit that person had to when it shipped, then we have the time to failure. And that's usually what we need is as a minimum. Now you can just do counts, which is a bit cruder, right? But if you have uh, the actual time of installation and the actual time of the failure or the reported failure, you're doing better. And some equipment, more expensive things, will have meters and logs and so on that will give you more detailed information if you can get access to it. Consumer products oftentimes have very vague when it got installed and when it failed. So many different industries are very, very different. But as if you're using just counts and just plotting how many failures come in per month, it's hard to understand whether you've got a if you're missing the time to failure data and you're just doing the counts of failures, it's hard to spot trends because your products that are in the field are at different points in their life. Some have just been installed and some have been there for maybe years. And so understanding the version or the serial number or some way of tracking how long this failed unit has been in the field is a great way to do it. And I saw it, Ravi mentioned Nevada analysis, which is a really nice tool for organizing it. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But the first part is, well, where do you find it? Where do you discover the data that you need, right? If it's not handed to you in a nice bundled up spreadsheet ready to go into your favorite analysis package, where do you have to go to find the data? And I saw a handful of notes that people have put in. But where could you find the data? Let's say you're in a new organization and they haven't done field data analysis other than maybe the counts on the shipping dock. Where would you go to look for the information? Catch up. Sales reports, service technician reports, call logs, yep. Service centers, call centers, repair centers. Some organizations have like a customer-facing database that they record which product they bought and which product their reporting's failed. There's many ways to tap into that kind of database. A few other people are typing in some good ideas. Now, customer complaint records, ERIDA data. That's interesting, Louis. Isn't that kind of a compulated database and not necessarily your products? We're looking at field data for your products, for your systems. The maintenance management systems, Gene. Yeah, and next month I'm going to be talking more about CMMS systems and analyzing repairable data, more appropriate for factory settings. But CMMS does have great information potentially, but it's not all of these sources, whether it's sales or call center or the CMMS, um, they're not necessarily organized or set up for reliability work. They record bits and pieces of what we need, and it often takes some uh, creativity to go get the actual numbers you need. Yeah, Gene, I actually did use the spare parts one. We were looking at fans in particular, and we used the replacement fans being shipped out for these servers as a way to get a count or an estimate of the fan failure rates. Yeah. And nuclear industry. Let's hope you don't have too many failures or too much data in that one, Cecilia. But I'm sure there's things that go wrong in systems. But you're on it. Everybody's got is tapping into the different places and areas you can find the data. And yes, there's all kinds of places that it's out there, and in it, vehicles today, automobiles oftentimes have data loggers built right into their systems. And so when you go in for service, they can read off how many miles, what kind of conditions, how many times the brakes were applied, gear shifts, fuel consumption, miles per gallon, all kinds of data is recorded. And it gives them a pretty decent history of what's going on with the vehicle. Even computers and servers and consumer products to a large degree are in especially the more expensive, say, factory equipment or industrial equipment, is getting a whole lot more sensors and data logging put into place. So oftentimes we can interrogate a product and get a lot of the information we need. But to start, many of you mentioned the types of areas where we can go to find the data that we need. It's almost always somewhere else in the organization for some other purpose than for doing reliability analysis. And so it the problem is that like a sales group or a repair center is in let me know what kind of issues you see, but it's messy. It's it's not set up to be a a record of reliability performance. The repair center is oftentimes the records are set up so that they can track what parts they need for repairs or just for getting reimbursed or charging the warranty or for the billing purposes is oftentimes where the um, it I'm not sure if I lost audio or if it was just me pausing. Sorry about that. The problem with the data sets that are out in the organization is they are not organized or established primarily for reliability work. They're often set up for billing or for tracking or for account management or from a dozen different reasons primarily, and then we get access to it. Now, over time, in showing how useful the data analysis is of the field data, we can work with those different database owners to improve the information we're getting. Uh, Oftentimes, though, that takes time. And if you've ever opened up one of these databases or first looked at field data or call center data or whatever, it's a mess. You know, like we said right from the start, is we're not going to get perfect data. And and if we can get the basics of this stuff, you know, we're in way better shape. So and get started and just recognize that the data is going to be messy, right? And start with what you have and make improvements as you can see where the opportunities are. But how bad can it get? What kind of messy data have you seen? And throw out a couple ideas here that I have is in my chat window keeps scrolling to the middle, so I have to keep getting back to it. Let me catch up with you. Yeah, so getting better data is great. And yeah, free-form text, Richard, yeah, that's a bane, especially if you have a lot of records and the information is there. If you only have test data, say a diagnostic that's run on a machine that's in the field, it may be difficult to figure out, well, which is the piece you really need and what's the timeline of it. And yeah, the things that we've seen is that it's duplicate entries or it's missing information or it's doesn't have the serial number recorded, so we don't know when it was put into service. Um, Sometimes we don't even know what region of the world the product came back from or what type of product or model number it was, configuration. Uh, but we also get inaccurate entries. It may say it was a failure when it was just a restocking type of return. I had that happen once where I got called down to the shipping dock because there was a whole pallet of new equipment down there that was still in factory bulk ship. And it was sent back from a distributor because they ordered too many. And so they just returned it, but called it a warranty return. So it really threw off our numbers again. So, Xander, I'm sorry to see the audio gone. I know you've had trouble over the last few months, but hopefully we're back. Let me get my cursor back. And so if you can hear me, let me know if I lost my audio altogether. I did hear a phone beep off. All right. Oh, he's fine. Okay. So I think I just lost his phone line. All right. Yeah, the some of the automation in the databases, especially if you have a barcode or something like that, it can help, especially if you get your hands on the product. Now, sometimes though, we don't get the product back. In some product lines, in some businesses, it's not cost effective to ship the product back. I think there's a missed opportunity there. Yet there's plenty of situations where the customer just throws it away, and then we give them a new product or do a field repair, or send them the spare parts, for example, if there's appropriate diagnostics. Uh, but getting good information and keeping it consistent within a database is often difficult. And because the databases, as I mentioned earlier, are often set up for other purposes. And so I think the most common example is that the shipments of, say, replacement components could be mixed in with sales or with spare parts shipments that are just going to be stocked as local spares and not used immediately to do or effectively do a repair, as an example. But what is most common is that we just don't get good, complete data, and oh wait, not a whole lot we can do about that, and you just deal with it. So one of the ways is that once you do find a source of data, as messy and as disorganized as it is now we need to put it in some semblance of some setup so that we can actually use it. And so I think it was Ravi or maybe it was Thomas that mentioned the Nevada chart. And it's a simple tool, and I've used it with teams that, especially if they're doing return authorizations and they're receiving parts or returns, failed units back into the factory, basically. Uh, and it's just a convenient chart, can be done manually. Oftentimes people put it in a spreadsheet, but it's a convenient way to just collect the data. Now, the chart itself is very difficult to glean any an analysis off of it, but fortunately, tools like um, Weibo++ allow you to cut and paste Nevada charts directly into the software. And so it frees up a lot of the manipulation of data to get it in the organization you need for the analysis. And so if you're getting information about how many you're shipping, say by week or by day or by month, which is common, and then how many returns you're getting, but from that particular shipment. So if I think I have an example here of a chart. And see if I can use my handy dandy pen. Bear with me while I figure out how to get it to work. So if I keep track of how many shipments I have per month, and so in January we shipped, say, 3,500 units, and say some medical device of some sort. But right away in that first month, we got 3 failures. And so I'm just recording it as the month, and you could pick whatever timeline makes sense for you. And then in February, oops, I have to be careful with my fingers on this screen. I got 6 more failures, but they were from this 3519 that was shipped out in January. But I also got 4 units that we recognize as coming from the 6,000 or so that we shipped in February, and so on. So here in May, we received 25 units that were from the 7,000 or so that were shipped. And so each month, as we get units in, you can just tally, count basically how many are coming back, and then organize it from the month that they came from. And you can see pretty quickly is that these 6 units here that were from the May shipment that failed in May have been in service for about a month or 15 days, or we can estimate it as 1 month. And then the 8 failures that we got in June that were also from that May shipment were there for about 2 months. And we can very quickly get time to failure information. Plus, we subtract these 14 units from the number shipped to find out how many are still out there and in service. And so 4,222 minus 14 is what, 4,206, if I got it right. And it gives us an estimate of how many are censored, how many have not failed as of yet, and they've been out there for about 2 months in that case. Whereas the January ones, we have a bigger tally here to pull together, but we'd subtract that sum from our 3,500, and it would give us a estimate of how many have been out there for 6 months and have not failed yet, indicating they're right censored, they haven't failed at this point, or that we know of. And so, of course, these numbers might be higher, just not reported, but we don't have that information, and so we have to deal with what we have. All right, so the Nevada chart gets its name, I suspect, unless it was invented by a Dr. Nevada, is from this shape here. Oops, let me get my drawing back. And let's see, I think there's a way I can clear this. There we go. And it's this triangle shape here. The state of Nevada looks kind of like that. California sits over on the left side of it, but the lower half of Nevada has this triangle type shape to it. So for some reason, somebody thought it looked like this lower part of the state of Nevada, or it was invented by maybe a data analyst that happened to be named Nevada. I really don't know. So anyway, so I think it's the state, but that's what I've heard, but I could be wrong. So I don't want to not credit the appropriate person for it. So another way to organize your data, and as I mentioned in the Nevada plot, is tools like YWOW++ allow you to import the shipment column and the returns area directly into the software, and it does all the manipulations to figure out the time to failure and the sensor data, and sorts it all out for you and makes that analysis really quick. But it also makes it really convenient to organize the data as you collect it month to month. So I talked about suspensions and censoring, and in some software we call it suspensions. Is that we up to this point in time we believe it's been working, or over this interval we believe there was a failure and we're not sure exactly when it was. So it might be a month-long interval that we check once a month, and if it fails, it's somewhere in that month. So depending on your analysis, you may assume it's failed just after your last check, or it's midpoint, or just before you checked. And each has its own pros and cons as an approach. But the basic idea is that at some point we know it's been working and we want to include that data in our analysis. If we only look at failure data, every month we look at, say, the 10 failures, it gives us little information about what's the next month's probability of failure occurring. And are those 10 failures out of 1,000 units, so that it's say a 1% defect rate? Or is it only 100 units out there and we have a 10% problem? And so we need to know how many units we've shipped and how many are still believed to be operating. That's what we mean by censoring. So if I'm organizing this in a spreadsheet and not using say a Nevada chart, and I often end up with this spreadsheet, so keeping track and doing the math, and I'm using the same set of data that I had in the top of that Nevada chart example. Let's see, I'll pull up my drawing tool again. And so what I did is I took this 3, 6, and 3 here, this 12 units that have failed from the January shipment, and I subtracted them from the 3519 to get the 3507. And that's how many I believe are still operating. So the S for, at least in Weibull++, indicates that it's suspended, that they're still operating as of, in this case, my units are in months, is after 3 months. The remainders, though, 3 of them failed after 1 month, 6 failed after 2 months, and 3 more failed in the 3rd month of age. So I've got my time to failure data broken out for the different durations I have, and I have grouping the data. You could do this individually, as you'd have a failed at 1 month replicated 3 times, and failed at 2 months replicated 6 times. It happens that in Weibull++ you can do grouping. So instead of listing 3,500 suspensions individually, I can put them all in one line, which is convenient. And other software packages do something similar. And then so on. So I go right down the list and keeping track of how many are suspended, and then working out then how many have failed after different durations in time. And so if you're collecting data, say, from a call center or from a field service center, you may have serial numbers, and you can find out when it was shipped, and that gives you the duration of how long it failed. But then keep track, do the tallying of how many remainders from that shipment are still operating. Now it gets fuzzier when you have retirements, or you have replacements or upgrades that fundamentally change the system. And so these spreadsheet approaches, or whether you're using Nevada charts or not, can get rather complex. So, and every situation seems to be a little different. And oftentimes it's the longest or hardest part of doing the analysis is organizing the data to deal with, well, how many are still operating and how many have failed and when. Those are kind of the biggest pieces of it. Right. So I went through that pretty quick, but it's one of those where every situation's a little bit different. So let me get into a couple of plots, and we'll go with that. And I see a few questions. I think they're comments. Okay, doing good. All right. So The first step in almost any data analysis that I've ever been familiar with or seen written about is not to calculate MTBF, which you can do pretty quickly. And if you listen to any of my other podcasts or seen the No MTBF site, understand that I would not recommend that. Is it generally is not terribly useful. But a good first step is to plot the data. Just plot it. Plot it a dozen different ways if you can. Plot it just the counts of failures per time, per age. Do a histogram, for example, of the age of products when they fail, and get a sense of is it failing early and then as they get older they get better, a decreasing failure rate, or is it wearing out to some extent, or is it some complex pattern? You have enough data to find a bimodal behavior maybe. Uh, but just plot it. Plot it by region. Maybe the coastal regions are showing a higher failures for corrosion-related failure mechanisms than more inland, or areas that are more prone to lightning are seeing power supply failures more often than other ones. So part of the plotting process is just explore the data. Take a look at it as many different ways as you can and see what it tells you, and start looking for those patterns that give you information, not just a stack of numbers. Now, if I take that uh, 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 Nevada chart that I showed a few slides ago, and I drop that into Weibull++, I can do a Weibull plot. This is a plot that shows, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. Get my little drawing tool here. Come on, there we go. It shows time, and in this case it's in months on the x-axis, and I know these are probably small on your screen, and the vertical axis is the probability of failure given that amount of time. And so in this particular case, and it goes for about, here's 1 month, and this is 10 months, so at about, what is it, maybe 5 or 6 months, somewhere in there, maybe 7 months, it's on a log-log scale, is I have about 1% of my units have failed. So of all of those thousands of shipments, after about 6 months, about 1% of them have failed. And so I could read it that way. And so all of the ones that failed after the first month are kind of stacked up. It looks like 1 point, but there's actually dozens of failures in there, and so on. Each of these points is just because I'm counting only by month, they're going to stack up on that point. So there's representing many different failures. I think there were something like 23 or 24 failures altogether. And and yes, Ravi, it's a Weibull analysis because it's including all of the sensor data. I got a couple thousand units that haven't failed yet, and that's why there's nothing up here. All of my failures are down in the low percentiles because I have lots of samples that have run for 6 months and for 5 months and 4 months and 3 months. And I think there's a way you can show where the sensor data is. They call them whiskers on the plot. So that's one way you can see them. But if I didn't include the sensor data, it would show these 5 months worth of data would be spread out across the entire spectrum of failures. And it would look like everything fails after 5 months. We know that's not true. And so it's a way for us to account for the ones that haven't failed. And so a Weibull plot, a cumulative distribution plot technically, gives us a way to visualize the failures. And so, Gene, my drawings are on the PowerPoint slide for plotting and patterns. Oh, I'm on the wrong slide. Let's see what I can do. Let me get rid of this. So are you able to see the plot, or am I off somewhere else in the slide set? Maybe I hit the wrong button here. Okay, so you got the plot now. No, the plot's not visible. I know it takes a moment or two for it to push out to all the areas. So hopefully, Ravi, it'll come up for you pretty soon. So in the meantime, imagine a Weibull plot. It's basically uh, time versus probability of failure, and I've got a few points on it with a line fit to it. Now, one of the questions, I think, Ravi, you mentioned it, is how do you spot outliers? Well, years ago, I got my master's degree in statistics, uh, and what we asked that question as we're doing regression analysis and fitting distributions to data, is how do we identify an outlier? And this professor that was a visiting professor from Australia said, we'll plot it out on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, on a regular sheet of paper, and I think he used A4 paper, being from Australia. And if the data points, if they fit under a number 2 pencil, then it's a pretty good fit. If it's outside of the number 2 pencil, either you have the wrong fit, line fit to it, or you have an outlier. And the general approach was to leave the outliers in the data until you could conclusively make the judgment that they are from a different source, or they are a clerical error, for example, or completely different in some fundamental way to influence your analysis. And when in doubt, plot it with and without the outlier and see if it really changes anything and see what happens. What's the impact of that outlier? But your first pass is just plot it. Use all your data and plot it and see what it tells you. And Cecilia, when you get 0 failures, and you mentioned earlier you're in the nuclear industry, so I'm glad to hear you have 0 failures. In those cases, right, there's no failures to plot, but you do have time that units of operating, say you have a bunch of valves that have been operating in a cooling system, and they've accumulated hours of service and so many actuations, for example. Well, if you have a study or information that talks about what's the slope of the Weibull plot, what's the beta value of those devices, you can use what's called a Bayesian approach and just say, well, my accumulated time is up to here, and my slope, that gives me 1 point on the curve, say at 1,000 hours, I have 0 failures. So you make that at, depending on how many units you have, say you have 100 units, say in the next instant, if I have my first failure, that would represent the first percentile of failures. So I'd have the probability of failure is at 1%, or 0.1, at 1 on this graph, and then 1,000 hours. So that gives you a point on the curve, and then use the slope to draw the rest of the curve. But you're making the assumption that, well, 2 assumptions. One is that in the next instance, I would get my first failure. And 2 is that the failure mechanisms would follow the slope of the pattern of failures that we expect. And so it's not perfect, but when you have no failures, there's not many other ways to approach it. And so it's one way I would go with it. All right, let's see if I catch up any other questions. Yeah, and Sean, well, yeah, hopefully you get 0 failures in the space industry. Although there have been some spectacular failures recently. But again, just using the Bayesian, the Y-Bayes is one term I've heard used many times. And the other part is to look more at the physics of failure type information and looking at, is it consistent with what you expect to be failing, and using the tabulated previous data or studies or time to failure studies to go after it is one way to go at it. Okay. So now there are many, hopefully now you can see just a blank plot. It's going to be a Weibull plot, this log-log scale with time and unreliability up. Oh, good, Ravi, thanks. Glad it's working now. All right. And so my drawing tool here, see if it comes up clean. All right. So one way when you plot it, and just I use this format because it's often very telling and very informative. So if I get a plot and it's a very shallow slope, right? The beta is less than 1. What does that mean? What does that indicate that's going on? Yeah, design failures. I always blame the designers, by the way, so that's a safe answer with me. Uh, but typically, I start looking for installation damage or manufacturing defects or a batch problem from a supplier that got it past our quality checks going out the door. But yeah, infant mortality. It's early life failures. I I learned that in the medical industry they don't like calling it infant mortality for obvious reasons, so they call it early failures or out of box failures, those kinds of things. And if I get a plot, see if I can change color here on the fly. If I get a plot that shows more of a, a slope that's greater than 1, right, it indicates that I have a wear out, that I have an accelerating rate of failure with time. And the types of failures I look for will be slightly different. I'm looking for wear patterns or corrosion or some other fundamental mechanism that will drive everything to failure. In both cases, though, it's not conclusive. You can have a very steep beta value within the first month of your system. I worked with one product where they shipped, I think, 70,000 uh, uh, fitness devices, and 50,000 failed in the first month. And they had a problem with sealing and from liquid and from water and so on. And so it failed fairly quickly once they got into the field, and it was a wear out mechanism. It just once they got wet, within a week they would fail. And as soon as they saw this slope taking off like this, they started the recall and the backing up and figuring out what was going on. Now I don't know about the Samsung case with their phone, what kind of slope they have. They probably had very few failures, yet given the nature of the failure, they took action to minimize that amount of damage that it would do to their brand. But in general, we're looking at all kinds of data, and getting a plot and getting the slope of this gives us a clue as to where to go. Now, ideally is you get some units back and you start looking at the types of actual failures. What is the failure mechanisms that are involved, and what can you do about it? What are the things that are design defects that will affect every product, or are they defects that are acceptable from a business point of view, that they're a relatively low probability of occurring, and it's economical to do repairs or replacements? Is it matching our uh, projections for what we expected it to do? So just by plotting the data, you get a sense of where this is. So let me go up to the next curve. So one way to do that is, and I've seen this on Weibull++, is what they do is they put a red dot basically on the curve that say represents their warranty period, and their target number, say a 2% failure rate over their warranty period is what their target is. So then as the data starts to come in, if your data is over here, you're not going to meet your target. You're failing much faster and sooner and more often than what you plan for in your warranty, versus a plot that's over to the right of your target. Now you're exceeding your warranty targets. Your 2% failure rate doesn't occur until much later. So you can put your targets on it, and they can be multiple targets, say for your out-of-box period, the warranty period, and useful life period. So you can track how you're doing against your targets with a simple plot. All right, let's see if I just change the, it's going to make me draw. And then one other pattern I want to illustrate, maybe I've seen this one before. Oops, I got my drawing back. Let me get rid of that. Is what happens if you see a plot that looks like this? What's going on? I call this the hockey stick. I think, Ted, you're from Canada, so you know what a hockey stick reference is. But a hockey stick is a long shaft with a paddle at the end of it for those that are from climates that don't play hockey. And but it has this angle to it. What's going on here? Yeah, Thomas, several failure modes, yes. Different failure modes, different failure mechanisms, as I would. Steep increase in failures. Yep, good, good. And what typically is going on, if you take a look at this data and you track a couple of what actually failed there for 2 units that failed there and say 2 units that failed here, do detailed failure analysis, is that these failure mechanisms will probably be different. And so this one was a very low probability of failure out to some point in time, and then it took off. And usually a steeper slope indicating a lack of maintenance or a fundamental wear out mechanism. Had this occur one time, this circuit board used a lot of optocouplers to isolate parts of the circuit, and they ran for about 8,000 hours, 8K hours, and then they failed very, very quickly, had a very steep slope. Very few of them survived to 9,000 hours. So after 24-hour, 7 days a week operation, at about a year, all of those components basically failed. And so they ended up just designing them out of their circuit boards. The failures they would have during the rest of the year were a mix of random various different things, broken solder, cold solder, some broken traces, a few individual components would fail. It wasn't too bad, and it was very acceptable for him until it hit this hockey stick and really took off. So if you see an unusual pattern, another pattern that I often see looks more like an S, where the early failures here that indicate this very steep slope are usually reporting anomalies, where people just wait to the end of the month to ship it in, or things get tabulated on a weekly or monthly basis, which artificially steepens this part of the curve, usually because there's very few data points. And it's on a log scale. So oftentimes, unless there's something fundamentally going on there, it's usually just a handful of points, and it looks weird, but there's really no information in them. Whereas if you get to a hockey stick part, it's a much bigger problem, much bigger issue. So the point of doing all of this analysis or just simple plotting and asking questions about your data is really just that, so that you can ask better questions, right? Is you start asking those questions of, well, is my data good, right? Start question the sources and understand and weed out your data and question how accurate it is and clean it up where you can. But once you exhausted that realm, that's the data you have. Now let it speak to you. So plotting and looking at it a number of different ways, from histograms to trend charts to Weibull plots, log normal plots, or the variety of other tools we have available, is look at the data. Now, it often has to be coupled with the failure analysis, is understand those patterns you're seeing. Are they consistent? Is there a dominant failure mechanism, or are there multiple failure mechanisms going on? Let the data help you figure out which units you should do analysis on, help focus that. But then look for those improvements. Look where you can improve the data you're collecting. Look for the better ways and more efficient ways to refine the information you have. And then tie it to your business objectives. Are we on target or not? Or can we make adjustments to bring us into target for what we are expecting to do with the reliability performance? But what the thing that I enjoy the most about doing data analysis is, well, the what ifs. Is asking those questions if you have the data available is, for example, do the coastal installations have a higher failure rate than the inland installations? How about altitude? Does Mexico City and Denver have higher failure rates than coastal installations, for example? How about types of usage and differences in failure mechanisms for different regions or types of customers? So depending on how rich your data is and what kinds of information you can have available, is you can start looking at this in a number of different ways. And it's a virtuous circle where the better your information is that's coming out of your data, the better the questions you can ask and get answers from. And so I look at the whole process of doing field data analysis is really to be able to ask and answer better, more accurate, more meaningful questions. And so that's where I guess the overall objective is. All right, so I think we're right up against the top of the hour there, and they're getting serious in the other room. They're taking out a part of a wall, so hopefully it's not too much of a distraction. But I'll stay on the line if there's any questions. Appreciate everybody joining me today and all of the comments. I think this group wins as the most active group, so I think that's awesome. So next month, second Tuesday of the month, we're going to talk about repairable data analysis, which is a bit different. And we'll also take a look in November. I'm going to reschedule the session I missed last month. I got called on jury duty the night before our webinar, and I had to report in the morning when we would have run the last webinar. So first time in 2 years I've missed one, so I apologize for that. And we're rescheduled it for November. It's going to be on what do you do when a customer requests MTBF? And I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So that's coming up November. So I'll hang out on the line here. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, and it'll be available up on Accendo Reliability in a couple of days. But I'll stay on the line if there's any questions. And once again, appreciate